Sweat, cheap rosewater, and desperation hung heavy in the parish hall. 7 men had looked at Abigail, tallied her worth, and walked away. Then the door hinges screamed. A man smelling of wood smoke and raw winter stepped in, carrying more gold in his saddlebags than the town was worth. Dust motes danced in the stifling yellow light of the oil lamps, choking the air inside the community barn. Abigail Hayes dug her fingernails into the rough wool of her skirt, trying to distract herself from the damp heat pooling at the nape of her neck. Her collar was too tight. It chafed her skin, leaving a red ring that felt like a permanent brand. Fiddle music, sharp and out of tune, scraped against her eardrums. It was the annual spring match in Red Creek, a thinly veiled livestock market, where the local men selected wives from the desperate and the dowried. Abigail was neither. She was 24, considered practically ancient in the territory, with hands calloused from splitting cordwood and a family name that tasted like cheap whiskey and bad debts in the mouths of the townsfolk. Her father had died in a drunken stupor behind the livery 3 winters ago, leaving her nothing but a drafty cabin and a reputation as a burden. Horace Miller stood before her. He was the 7th man to approach her tonight. Horace owned the dry goods store. He smelled of peppermint drops and unwashed hair, his breathing wet and shallow. Abigail looked at his boots. They were polished leather, scuffed at the toes. She waited for the familiar pivot. "You've got sturdy hips, Miss Hayes," Horace muttered, his gaze sliding away from her face, landing somewhere around her shoulder. "A man needs sturdy hips for children, but," he swallowed loudly, "my mother says a woman from a house of vice and liquor brings rot to the roots. I need a wife who can keep the books, not one who'll steal from the till." He didn't wait for her response. He simply turned his back and melted into the crowd of swirling calico and heavy broadcloth. Abigail didn't cry. The urge to weep had dried up somewhere around the 4th rejection. Instead, a sour metallic taste flooded the back of her throat. 7 men had walked across the splintered floorboards, sized her up, and found her lacking. The blacksmith had wanted a woman with a softer face. The newly arrived rancher from Kansas had demanded a dowry of at least $50. The livery boy, barely 19, had taken one look at the hardened set of her jaw and stammered an apology before fleeing toward the giggling miller's daughters. She pressed her spine against the rough-hewn timber of the barn wall. The wood snagged through her dress, scratching her back. It felt grounding, real. She closed her eyes and let the suffocating noise of the room wash over her. Boots stomping, skirts swishing, men laughing with too much rye on their breath. She was a ghost in a room full of the living, standing in the shadows of the punch bowl, waiting for the torture to end so she could walk the 3 miles back to her empty, freezing cabin. Then, the music stopped. It wasn't a gradual fade. The fiddler simply ceased mid-bow, producing a jarring, dying squeak that hung in the humid air. The heavy oak doors at the front of the barn had been pushed open. A draft of biting night air swept into the room, cutting through the stench of rosewater, stale beer, and nervous sweat. Abigail opened her eyes. The crowd was parting. It was a slow, shuffling retreat, driven by an instinct older than words. He stood in the doorway, blocking the moonlight. Caleb Mercer, Hilarolim mountain man, a hermit who lived somewhere up near the jagged peaks of the Divide. The townsfolk traded stories about him like currency. They said he survived the blizzard of '82 by sleeping inside the carcass of a grizzly bear. They said he owned the timber rights to the entire northern ridge. They knew he was rich when he came down twice a year for supplies. He paid in raw, heavy gold nuggets that made the assayer's hands shake, but no amount of wealth could buy him a place in polite society. He looked like a force of nature that had merely decided to take human shape. He was massive, his shoulders stretching the seams of a heavy coat made of patched elk hide and thick canvas. Mud, dark and fresh, caked his heavy boots. His hair was dark, unruly, falling past his ears, and a thick, unkempt beard obscured the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that pinned the room into silence. They were a pale, startling gray, catching the lamplight like chipped ice. He stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The heat of the room seemed to shrink away from him. As he walked down the center of the floor, the smell hit Abigail. It wasn't the polite bay rum of the town merchants. It was the raw, primal scent of crushed pine needles, wood smoke, damp earth, and the metallic tang of old blood. It was the smell of survival. Caleb didn't look at the whispering women. He walked straight past the miller's daughters, who clustered together like frightened hens, their pastel dresses looking suddenly absurd against his rugged silhouette. He ignored the widowed schoolteacher who nervously adjusted her spectacles. He didn't even glance at the mayor's niece, the undisputed prize of the evening, who stood frozen with her fan half raised. He kept walking. The floorboards groaned under his weight. Abigail watched him, her heart doing a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She wasn't afraid, but an animal alertness flared in her chest. She pushed herself slightly away from the wall, her chin lifting defensively. He stopped. Right in front of her, up close, the sheer size of him was suffocating. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. His face was weathered, deeply lined at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun and snow. A jagged white scar cut through the hair on his left cheek, disappearing into his beard. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a bow. He just looked at her. His eyes scanned her face, dropping to the frayed, mended lace at her throat, taking in the rigid, defiant set of her shoulders, and the calluses clearly visible on her bare hands. He didn't look at her hips. He didn't look for a dowry purse. He looked at her like he was reading a map of a treacherous terrain, deciding if it was worth the crossing. Abigail held her breath. Her stomach twisted, a chaotic mix of irritation and a strange, terrifying vulnerability. She wanted to look away, to break the heavy silence that had settled over the entire barn, but her pride refused to let her yield. For 10 agonizing seconds, the richest, wildest man in the territory simply stared down the poorest, most rejected woman in Red Creek. "You," Caleb Mercer said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like boulders shifting beneath a frozen river. It sounded rusty, as if he hadn't used it in months. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a romantic plea. It was a declaration of fact. Abigail felt a hot flush of anger rise to her cheeks. She was tired of being a spectacle. She was tired of the town's pity and their scorn. She crossed her arms over her chest, digging her nails into her own sleeves. "Me what?" she snapped. Her voice rang out sharper and louder than she intended, echoing in the dead silence of the barn. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone near the back muttered a quick prayer. Women didn't snap at Caleb Mercer. Men crossed the street to avoid walking in his shadow. Caleb didn't blink. He simply tilted his head, a microscopic adjustment that made him look like a wolf evaluating a cornered deer. "You're coming with me." "I am doing no such thing," Abigail retorted, her pulse hammering wildly in her throat. She gripped the edge of her sanity with both hands. "I am not a sack of flour to be tossed over your shoulder, Mr. Mercer. If you've come to buy a wife, you can get in line with the rest of the hypocrites." The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. She waited for the explosion. She expected him to turn violently, to sneer at her poverty, to crush her fragile dignity, just as Horace Miller had done 5 minutes earlier. Instead, a profound stillness settled over Caleb. He reached into the deep pocket of his elk hide coat. A woman to Abigail's left whimpered, stepping back. Caleb pulled out a heavy, canvas pouch. It was stained with oil and dirt. He tossed it lightly into the air and caught it. It landed in his massive palm with a dense, muted clink that only heavy coinage could make. "I don't wait in lines," he said softly. The quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than a shout. "And I don't buy people. I buy land. I buy timber." He took a single step closer. The heat radiating off his body was immense. "I'm looking for a partner. Someone who knows how to freeze and how to starve and how to stay standing anyway." He looked around the room, his lip curling in a fraction of disgust as he took in the pale, terrified faces of the townsfolk. None of them know how to survive. They just know how to hide. He turned his pale gray eyes back to Abigail. You've been standing against this wall taking bullets all night. You didn't cry. You didn't run." Abigail's breath hitched. He had been watching. From outside? From the doorway? The realization that this wild, feral man had seen her humiliation, had witnessed Horace Miller and the 6 before him discard her, sent a fresh wave of heat through her veins. "My father was a drunk," Abigail said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, weaponizing her own shame before he could. "I have no money. I have debts. My shoes have holes in them. The town thinks I'm rotten." "The town is a collection of fools building houses on mud," Caleb replied instantly. "I don't care about your father. I care that your hands look like you can chop wood. I care that you look me in the eye." He extended his hand. It was enormous, the knuckles scarred and thick, the palm wide and rough. "There's a cabin up the ridge. 10 miles. It's solid. There's meat in the smokehouse and gold under the floorboards. It gets cold enough to crack stones in January. You come with me. You'll never be hungry again. And you'll never have to look at these people again." Abigail stared at the offered hand. The silence in the barn was absolute. She could hear the sputter of a dying oil lamp above them. She looked past his broad shoulder. She saw Horace Miller, his mouth slightly open, his face pale with shock. She saw the women who had whispered about her ragged hems. She saw the dirt beneath her own fingernails. If she stayed, she would walk back to a freezing cabin. She would starve slowly over the winter, or finally succumb to the town's charity, scrubbing floors for pennies until her back broke. If she went with him, she was walking into the unknown wilderness with a man who was more myth than human. But he hadn't asked for sturdy hips for childbearing. He hadn't asked for a clean ledger. He had asked for her grit. Slowly, deliberately, Abigail uncrossed her arms. Her hand trembled, just a fraction, as she reached out. When her fingers met his palm, the contrast was startling. Her skin, though rough for a woman, felt fragile against the absolute density of his grip. He didn't squeeze her hand. He merely enveloped it, his calluses scraping against hers. His skin was incredibly warm. "I need my coat," Abigail said, her voice remarkably steady. "I have furs in the wagon," Caleb said. He didn't let go of her hand. Instead, he turned, pulling her gently but firmly alongside him. They walked back down the center of the barn. The crowd parted wider this time, shrinking back against the walls as if the two of them carried a plague. Abigail kept her chin high. The fiddle lay abandoned on a chair. The suffocating heat of the room no longer bothered her. Her skin was tingling, her mind racing. When Caleb kicked the heavy oak door open, the frigid night wind slammed into them. Abigail gasped, the cold biting through her thin wool dress instantly. Outside, hitched to a sturdy post, was a wagon unlike any she had seen. It wasn't a rickety pioneer cart. It was built of thick, treated timber, resting on heavy iron-rimmed wheels. 2 massive draft horses, black as pitch and breathing plumes of steam into the moonlight, stamped their hooves impatiently. The harness leather was thick and oiled, the buckles gleaming with heavy, solid silver. The wealth was quiet, functional, and undeniable. Caleb walked her to the side of the wagon. He reached into the back and pulled out a massive blanket woven from heavy gray wolf pelts. Without a word, he draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it almost buckled her knees. It smelled intensely of the animal, of earth, and of Caleb himself. It was the warmest thing she had ever felt. "It's a rough ride up," Caleb said, stepping up to unhitch the horses. He didn't look back at her as he spoke. "You get motion sickness. You throw up over the side, not in the bed." Abigail pulled the thick fur tighter around her throat, burying her cold nose into the soft pelt. She looked back at the glowing yellow windows of the parish hall. She could hear the frantic, hushed murmuring starting up inside. Tomorrow, the gossip would run through Red Creek like a wildfire. Abigail Hayes ran off with the mountain man. She turned back to the wagon, placing her boot on the iron step. For the first time in 3 years, the hollow ache in her chest was gone, replaced by a terrifying, thrilling pulse of survival. "I don't get sick, Mr. Mercer," Abigail said, pulling herself up onto the wooden bench. "Just drive." Wheels ground against frozen, rutted mud, sending violent, bone-rattling shudders up Abigail's spine. The wagon pitched sideways as the heavy draft horses dragged it over an exposed route. Abigail bit the inside of her cheek to keep her teeth from clacking together, tasting a hot, sharp copper tang. She pulled the heavy wolf pelt up to her nose. Red Creek was gone. The glowing yellow lights of the parish hall had vanished behind a dense wall of black spruce nearly an hour ago. Now, there was only the suffocating darkness of the ascent, broken by the faint, eerie silver of the moonlight catching on frost-tipped branches. The cold was absolute. It was not the damp, drafty chill of her valley cabin. This was a predatory, physical force. It pressed against her lungs every time she inhaled, freezing the moisture in her nose. Her toes, encased in thin, worn leather boots, had long since passed from aching to completely numb. Caleb sat beside her, a dark monolith against the night sky. He drove the massive horses in utter silence. He didn't use a whip. He didn't shout. He communicated with the team through minute shifts in the leather reins and low, guttural clicks in the back of his throat. The horses responded with blind trust, their immense haunches bunching and straining against the brutal incline. Abigail stole a glance at him from beneath the edge of the fur. Frost had begun to gather in his thick beard and on the collar of his canvas coat. He looked as immovable as the granite cliffs looming above them. Panic, cold and thin, fluttered in her chest. She had agreed to this. She had put her hand in the palm of a wild man and let him drag her away from the only world she knew. In the stifling heat of the barn, fueled by humiliation and spite, it had felt like a triumph. Out here, surrounded by the crushing silence of the wilderness, it felt like suicide. She could jump. The thought bloomed abruptly in her mind. She could throw off the heavy pelt, hurl herself into the snowbank, and run back down the trail. But run to what? To Horace Miller's scuffed boots? To the mockery of the miller's daughters? To starvation? You're breathing too fast. Caleb's voice startled her. It cut through the rhythmic thud of hooves and the groaning timber of the wagon. He didn't turn his head to look at her. I'm fine, Abigail lied, her voice shaking violently. Her jaw was locked with the cold. You're swallowing cold air, he said flatly. It drops your core. Breathe through your nose. Keep your mouth shut. Anger flared, a welcome hot spark in her freezing chest. I know how to breathe, Mr. Mercer. Clearly you don't. You're gasping like a caught trout. He shifted his weight, pulling back slightly on the reins as the wagon crested a steep ridge, and stopped thinking about jumping off the wagon. Abigail stiffened. I wasn't. Caleb finally turned his head. His pale eyes caught the moonlight. They were entirely devoid of judgment, presenting only cold, hard facts. Your muscles are twitching. Your eyes keep darting to the tree line. You jump now. You'll break an ankle in the ruts. The wolves will smell the blood before morning. If the cold doesn't stop your heart first. He stated it so casually, as if remarking on the weather. Abigail stared at him, the denial dying on her tongue. He was right. She was trapped by the elements, by her own choices, and by him. I'm not going to jump, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I made a bargain. Caleb held her gaze for a second longer before turning back to the trail. Good, we're crossing the timberline. The trees abruptly thinned out, revealing a desolate, awe-inspiring landscape. The world above the tree line was a canvas of jagged rock, deep snowdrifts, and howling wind. The wind hit the wagon with the force of a physical blow. Abigail gasped, squeezing her eyes shut as ice crystals whipped against her exposed forehead like broken glass. Caleb reached over. He didn't ask permission. His heavy gloved hand grasped the edge of the wolf pelt and yanked it harshly over Abigail's head, burying her completely in the dark, heavy fur. Keep it over your face, he ordered over the roar of the wind. She huddled in the dark, suffocating warmth of the animal skin. It smelled of dried blood, smoke, and sweat. It was disgusting. It was magnificent. She curled her knees to her chest, shivering so violently her ribs ached, and waited for the ride to end. Time lost its meaning. It could have been another hour. It could have been 3. Eventually, the brutal incline leveled out. The wind died down, blocked by some unseen barrier. The horses slowed to an exhausted, heavy-breathing walk. Wow. The wagon lurched to a halt. The sudden stillness was deafening. Abigail pushed the heavy pelt back. They were sitting in a small clearing surrounded by towering ancient pines. Tucked against the base of a massive granite wall was a structure. It wasn't a crude shack. It was a fortress built of thick, unpeeled logs, the gaps caulked solidly with clay and moss. The roof pitched sharply to shed the heavy snow, and a stone chimney rose from the center. "Get down," Caleb said, already wrapping the reins around the brake lever. "Move your legs before the blood pools and freezes." Abigail tried to obey. She threw off the fur and slid toward the edge of the wagon. But the moment her boots hit the iron step, her frozen knees buckled. Her legs simply refused to hold her weight. She pitched forward, a cry escaping her lips as the frozen ground rushed up to meet her. She didn't hit the dirt. Two massive arms caught her under her armpits. The impact knocked the breath out of her. Caleb hoisted her up effortlessly, suspending her against his chest, as if she weighed no more than a bundle of kindling. "I told you," he muttered, his breath warm against her freezing ear. Motion sickness. He didn't put her down. He carried her toward the heavy timber door of the cabin, kicking it open with the heel of his boot. Pitch darkness swallowed them as Caleb crossed the threshold. The air inside was completely stagnant, smelling intensely of cured leather, dried herbs, and old ash. It was brutally cold, but perfectly dry. He dropped her without ceremony onto a wooden chair near the center of the room. Abigail slumped against the hard backrest, her teeth chattering so vilely she thought they might crack. She wrapped her arms around her chest, trying to draw her shivering body into the smallest possible space. Caleb moved in the dark with unnerving familiarity. A match flared, the sudden hiss of sulfur cutting through the silence. He touched the flame to a kerosene lantern hanging from a ceiling beam. Warm yellow light spilled across the room. Abigail squinted, taking in her new reality. It was a single massive room. The floorboards were wide and polished, smoothed by years of heavy boots. The walls were lined with meticulously organized tools, axes of varying sizes, saws, traps, and lengths of oiled rope. A massive iron cookstove dominated the far wall, flanked by stacks of perfectly split cordwood. In the corner sat a heavy timber bed piled high with furs and thick wool blankets. There were no curtains, no rugs, no feminine touches. It was a machine designed purely for survival. Caleb ignored her shivering. He knelt before the iron stove, his large hands moving with precise, practiced efficiency. He shaved a handful of cedar kindling with a heavy hunting knife, struck another match, and blew gently on the flame. Within seconds, a fire crackled to life, the dry wood popping violently. He began feeding heavier logs into the belly of the stove. "Take your boots off," he ordered, not looking back at her. Abigail stared at the back of his canvas coat. "I can't feel my fingers." Her hands were curled into tight, useless claws, the skin mottled purple and white. Caleb slammed the cast iron door of the stove shut and stood up. He walked over to her, pulling a heavy, scarred wooden stool from under a table. He sat down in front of her. He reached out and took her right foot in both of his hands. Abigail flinched, instinctively trying to pull back, but his grip was like a vice. He didn't look at her face. He unlaced her scuffed boot with swift, unsentimental movements and pulled it off. He peeled away her damp, threadbare stocking. Her foot was pale as marble, the toes entirely white. Caleb muttered a harsh curse under his breath. He unbuttoned his heavy canvas coat and threw it aside. He wore a thick flannel shirt underneath, worn soft at the elbows. He took her frozen bare foot and placed it directly against the bare skin of his stomach, shoving it beneath his shirt. Abigail out the rems, a jolt of sheer panic rocketing through her. "What are you doing? Let go of me." She shoved her hands against his shoulders, trying to break free. "Stop fighting me," Caleb growled, easily absorbing her blows. "You rub frozen skin. You destroy the tissue. You put it near the fire too fast. The nerves will scream and the skin will die. It needs body heat. Slow heat." He trapped her ankle against his side, his hands clamping down over her calves to keep her still. Abigail froze, her breathing ragged. The heat radiating from his core was immense. It was terrifyingly intimate. She sat rigid in the chair, her bare foot pressed against the